Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be in Jifeng, and it's such a pleasure to get to talk to you, Kyle. We met, I think, 10 years ago maybe in Boston, and I remember hearing so much about this project over the years, and I'm so excited that now it's in our hands. And so I can't wait to hear a little bit more about how you came to this work, right? It's been a long time coming. It's been a decade. What drew you to Syaman and this work in particular to decide to translate this piece?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. This is, as has been noted now twice, it's taken me almost a decade, although I'd like to say I wasn't a complete full-time working on it for a decade. I did take bits and pieces as I went along, but I first encountered the piece in graduate school, and it was assigned for a class, and I read it, and I was instantly struck by both the storytelling, which I thought was different than most of the other Chinese writing that I'd been encountering, and then I was struck also by its kind of oppositional politics. The story opens in the first couple of paragraphs and starts by saying, you civilized reader, this book is not for you. You need to learn to think like me. And then it takes you on a journey. And so I was kind of instantly captured by the very distinct position that the author was taking.
That's so wonderful, and I think the distinct positionality, you kind of articulate that so beautifully in the translation itself. And that in your own introduction, for those that will get the book, you'll see that Kyle has his own introduction about the translation. And in the introduction itself, you note that there are kind of these stratifications of meaning that you've had to navigate,
Yes.
right? That in the introduction yourself, you said that the English language rendering of the work requires what you call double translation, right? Since the author had to first translate the Dao concept into words in Mandarin Chinese before you could actually translate that into English, right? So can you say a few words about that, and how do you see that double translation operating in the novel, in the English translation of the novel, but also in your own process of translating it?
Yeah, absolutely. This was something that is one of the reasons this project took as long as it did, was making sure that when I was approaching the Chinese language text, which is what I was translating, that I was getting the meaning that was meant to be translated from the Dao kind of rendering that was made into Chinese in the first place. And so the author thinks in his first language, which is the Dao language, already translates it, and then, as you'll see perhaps in the book, if you're interested in reading it, the author himself adds footnotes already to kind of start explaining this process of translation that he underwent in creating the original novel, which then, as I translated, I took the liberty of occasionally adding my own footnotes, since his expected audience was the kind of majority Han-Taiwanese readership. He assumed they would know certain things and not know certain things. And then as we translate it again for an Anglophone audience, it's the same problem once more. And so you add another layer of kind of translating what you maybe think an Anglophone reader may be unfamiliar with that was assumed in the Chinese translation. And so you have these layers as you go along. There's also an example, I suppose, that is in the introduction that is about fish that women can eat and fish that men can eat. And there's a whole article written about this that I cite in this, but it's a question of translation. And really, saying it as fish that men can eat or fish that women can eat is an oversimplification of what the actual practice is in Dao culture.
Yes.
But the author himself kind of made this first choice to simplify to that kind of a rendering. And at the end of the day, I have the great benefit of my author still being alive, unlike some people translating kind of classic novels or whatnot. And so I asked him, what do you want me to do with this? And he just said, stick with what I have. And I said, great. You've solved a lot of my problems and the ethical conundrums of the translator, so I don't have to intervene as much as I might have had to otherwise.
I love that part about the translation. So if folks get a chance to read it, so much of the work is actually also happening in the footnotes. And that the footnotes do a lot of the translational work, but also the kind of the stories that don't make it into the stories. And especially a lot of the stories are so mythical. You come and you know, in a perspective of a fish first, and you learn how to kind of swim through the ocean. And so a lot of the kind of information that needed context happens in the footnotes itself, but it doesn't distract from the narrative itself. And going to your point about even concepts of gender and marriage, right, and even kinship itself gets translated in the footnotes itself too. So I really love that. And I think that leads me into my next question about the fact that this double translation is not only happening through linguistic systems, right? It's not just that we're translating Dao culture into Mandarin Chinese and then Mandarin Chinese into English. What you're also doing is also translating worldviews, like completely different ideas about the world and one's relationship to the ocean, one's relationship to the fish. Is one also a fish, right? What is the gender dynamics of fishiness, right? And all that stuff you had to kind of really navigate, right? And so, so this is a two-part question then.
Okay.
One is kind of, what is your understanding of the ways in which that translation of worldview happened as you were going through it, right? And the other specifically is the way that the novel really kind of challenges us in the very beginning to reorient our humanness, right?
Yeah.
To like really think about new ways of understanding humanity's relationship with the world, with each other, and suggest a very different kind of ethical relationship and even responsibility to not only human world, but even long histories of stratifications of power like colonialism, right? Like how do you manage predatory kind of relationships, right? How do you create liberatory lineages in the face of death dealing? And all of these are kind of translated in these very, what seems like simple stories, but is actually challenging us to completely reorient our understanding of ourselves. So can you say a few more words about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You may have to jog my memory partway through if I wander off, but I think I may start with the second part of your question first about kind of how this other worldview gets presented in the text. So for people who have not had the chance to read the book yet, I will, give a spoiler of page 1, which is simply that the novel opens and tells you that it's going to be narrated from the perspective of a fish, specifically a giant trevally, which is a species of fish that is next to Orchid Island, where the Dao live. And it says, don't try to be rational and logical about the fact that I'm telling you I'm a fish. Get over it. I'm a fish, and here's the story that I have to tell you. And the opening chapter then proceeds to narrate the story of the Dao people from the perspective of the Oceanic world and from kind of the Piscean perspective. And that's how it all begins. And so you have a beginning of a relationship where it is the fish looking at the Dao people and saying, this is what I see them to be like. And there's a moment early on in the novel that the kind of legends are being told to the reader about the Dao people, and everyone becomes sick because the Dao had captured a particular fish and they had prepared it and eaten it incorrectly according to the sky gods who regulate these things. And the flying fish god descends down and tells the people, here's what's happened to you. You have prepared the fish wrong according to the taxonomies of fish. You separate them, you prepare them this way, and that will solve all these problems. And so the origins of the kind of fishing practices of today find themselves in these traditions that are passed down from a much longer and kind of timeless time. And this relationship then that it builds to get to your ethical question is more of one of codependence, of mutual imbrication of lives. We kind of think of ourselves as discrete individual human beings, and the story tries to reorient that worldview by saying that, no, you don't exist as just you. You exist as you in this network that is enmeshed with all these other living things. So whether it is fish, another part of the story deals with boat carving, and they go up to the mountains and they chop down specific trees that have been marked since they were, young children or their parents' trees, and they've made their mark in them, and 50 years later you go back and collect them, and you thank the forest, and you tell the tree that it's being reincarnated into a boat and going to extend its life in a new way. But it's all about kind of cycles of life and death, and building kind of equal relationships between human, non-human animals and the environment in a way that is more sustainable. And I think this maybe gets also to the question about violence and death dealing that you were talking about too. There's also comments on kind of Taiwanese fishing practices as in contradistinction to Da'o fishing practices. And some of this is narrated from a human perspective, some of it comes from the fish perspective, and the kind of short of it is the way it feels like from the kind of Da'o perspective is these Taiwanese fishers get these motorized modern fishing boats, they come down, they engage in trawling, where you kind of drag these giant nets across the bottom of the ocean and you wipe out these ecosystems. You catch everything. You don't really care if you're catching during the kind of spawning season or not, and you wipe out all of these fish, and so populations start dwindling. And so there's this very, not even veiled or subtle kind of critique of kind of capitalistic overconsumption relative to this more balanced and equal perspective about kind of existing in, coexisting in a balance or harmony.
Yeah, I remember one of my favorite parts of the translation in the novel is that we enter in as the fish first, and then we follow the fish around the ocean, and he gets really tired. He gets really tired, and then he almost dies in this battle with this Dao grandpa that wants to bring fish home. And then, but he, no spoiler alert, he survives, don't worry. But there's a later chapter when we get the perspective of that grandfather, right? That is battling the fish and then is also has so much empathy for the fish because he's looking at the fish and is like, oh man, you're very old and you're very tired. Like, are you okay? Right? So it's a very different relationship and they talk a lot about the motorboats, right? That just come and swipe through and there's no longer any fish to provide family anymore. But then there's this long kind of multi-page kind of internal dialogue almost of the fishermen and the fish, and there's these moments where they look at each other in their eyes and it's like, are you well? Kind of like even in that moment where you're trying to battle each other, that they have this kind of cross-species connection that is so beautiful, right? Are there other moments like this that you would like to kind of bring to the fore?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think the opening chapter is one of the best moments that you have of this, where you have this connection and there's this respect for this fish, or you see, and this particular fish who is our narrator talks about traveling around the ocean, and he comes back and has, I think it's 7 fish hooks kind of stuck in his gills because he's battled all of these fishermen and won, and he's very proud of that fact. And he battles again at the end of chapter 1 and survives, but each one of these has led to kind of these moments of cross-species respect, or everyone is out to survive. Right. And at the end of the day, I think that is one of the themes that comes back again, is that it is about survival, but also how to survive and what that means in changing times. And I think that's one of the interesting things structurally about the novel, is that you do start as a narrator fish in chapter 1, and then the grandpa that tries to catch him at the end of that chapter becomes your narrator in chapter 2, or becomes the focus at least in chapter 2. And then as you go down the next chapter, the narrative perspective moves from being about that grandfather to his son, who is raising his own grandchild. It's a multi-generational kind of story, but the perspective transfers from fish to human and then down the generations, and the fish comes back again at various points towards the end of the novel, which I won't spoil. But it all kind of moves through this cycle where everyone is seen to be connected to each other and learning how to coexist in the best way possible.
And I love that kind of interrelation, like the radical interdependency between the chapters and the different characters too, in a way that doesn't allow for a certain kind of fetishization of either kind of colonizer-colonized relationships and or even within Dao culture itself, right? We're tracing through multiple generations, and spoiler alert, we're going to trace to the grandchild who is mixed race, right? And so it becomes a lot more fluid, relational understanding of what a liberatory lineage looks like, or what life making under these conditions look like. And so that goes into perhaps my next question about, so much of this this reorientation of a kind of a radical interdependency between these characters and ecosystems of life and death. Also does a really great job of resituating Dao culture, right, in relation of Dao culture's own lineage of culture and history and place that is not devoid of its own history and lineage itself. It's not stuck in time, right? It is also constantly flowing and navigating and evolving, right, across 3 generations and across species. And that you could see how the novel navigates its relationship between Dao culture, its own lineage, but its relationship to the Han majority culture, and also to Taiwan itself, right? And I really love the ways in which the novel, and you like in your translated introduction, the introduction for the translator also kind of situate really deprovincializing Taiwan itself as part of this island mass, right? And then also the world, right? So I'm gonna ask you that part first, thoughts on that, and then I'll have specific questions.
Sure.
Yes.
No, I think the part about not making indigenous culture static is really important. Because we talk sometimes about, indigenous culture, traditional culture, and suddenly it invokes this image of pastness or not being contemporaneous with the present moment. And although you can have tradition, that does not necessitate that we are also not modern at the same time. And I think Syaman Rapongan makes a really strong effort at trying to show the modernity of tradition, if we can say it this way. And one of the metaphors that he uses actually in a different work, which again, someday maybe you'll get another one from me. But for the moment, this one is to, I believe, his Wings of Black is another work of his. And in the preface to that work, he describes how he would he thought of the world as kind of these orbital cycles of sun and moon. And so rather than seeing things as a zero-sum relationship between Dao tradition or Han tradition, they kind of cycled around with each other. And although that doesn't necessarily account for the colonial relationship that is imbalanced, he found a kind of rhythm that made everything present, or present tense. And so although there was tradition, and maybe it was happening at a syncopated rhythm to Han modernity, Dao modernity continues to be developing and evolving and apace with this other world that is Han modern life. So the Dao doesn't remain in the past. It is always evolving, always present tense.
I love that because it really kind of incubates like multiple temporalities at once as itself, like the temporalities and the historical lineages itself as also relational, but also not fixed in a linear sense, right? And so I wonder if, you bring up an excellent example of his ideas in general. Do you see that unfolding specifically in this piece, right? In terms of the narrative perspective, the story itself, right? How does the characters engage with Han culture in this particular piece, but also the structure of the text, which you already started talking a little bit about, but see if a little bit more.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting moments, and this will only be a minor spoiler, it's still worth the read, it doesn't ruin anything. There is a death in the family, and the parents of the deceased, it is a child, or an adult child that passes away, and the parents have to go and collect the remains of their daughter. And I think there's a really interesting passage where these parents who have spent essentially their entire lives on Orchid Island, where the Dao are from, have to fly from Orchid Island to Taiwan. It's not a long flight, but it is a flight. And they end up going to Taoyuan, to the major hospital there to collect the remains. And you have this passage where you get the experience of being in a hospital reflected back to you through a Dao perspective. And it's a place where evil spirits come and go for sure because death is haunting this space. But it's also something where they see predatory capitalism at play. And so they go to the morgue and you have to pay the mortician to beautify the body, or you have to pay for the kind of medical procedures, or you have to pay for the cremation and the urn. And they say, this is a very strange culture where you pay someone else when you die. Why would you do that? You just, it's a family affair, you take the body and you go home. And so there's this whole kind of reflection of Han culture and Han values through a different perspective. And this dialogue is one that is very sympathetic to the Dao perspective, obviously. But as an Anglophone reader, I think those practices, the critique of those practices will resonate with readers as well, where it'll help you see our own world through a different kind of lens. And I think that's one of the major values of this as well. To the structural part, I think I would add too, towards the end of the novel, you also get a visit from an unexpected relative.
Yes.
And the short of it is you have a relative who has not really been in the story at all until this kind of final chapter. And she appears out of nowhere, having swanned in from the UK, where she's pursuing a degree in non-Western religions at the University of Edinburgh. And she's come back to Taiwan to kind of do her field work and meet the locals. And it's a very strange encounter at first. And then there are other connections that maybe I will let you have to read to find out about. But it sparks this conversation about kind of how the modern scientific world looks at indigenous cultures and treats them as objects for study rather than ways of living.
Yeah.
And you have a really kind of, it's a very heartfelt conversation, but with kind of a tension behind it about how this child then that is, that appears in the story should be ultimately raised.
Yeah.
Do you raise the child by immersing it in Han values because you think that's the future? Do you go full Dao indigenous values? Or do you strike the middle ground? Is there a balance to be found? And so the last chapter really kind of ruminates on those issues through this perspective of the Taiwanese Western educated woman and the indigenous Dao people.
I love that example because I think going to the first example about the hospital, right? When the parents flew from Orchid Island to Taiwan to kind of see their daughters, well, spoiler alert, sorry. And there's a narration of how they got lost. It was harder to walk through the institutionalized space of a hospital than it was for them to just navigate the big seas, right? And so much of it was about even kind of navigating space and the world, and then also kind of what constitutes, and also that kind of relationship that you're talking about with the next generation, like the crossroads of how do you raise the next generation, is also a question about what is the toll, right, of forcing down one way or the other, which I think so many of the chapters are trying to talk about too. Do you want to say a little bit?
Well, I was going to say, there's an interesting comment that's made in passing in the novel where the parents of the deceased are trying to figure out, how you deal with the deceased body and get it back home so you can bury it properly. And then there's the question of the deceased child, which is the grandchild of the narrator's kind of perspective. But they, what happens to this child? And they say, let the kids deal with it so long as they don't change his name. And this gets to some really interesting politics in Taiwan, where for a very long time, indigenous people were forced to take Han-Chinese style names. And there's this tension that if they let this child go and kind of be entered into the system, he will become Chinese and will lose all of his indigenous identity. And so there's something also about naming in particular that's very important. And I'll steal one thing and add an extra moment on the naming in the book, maybe.
I was just going to say.
Which is a word that I'm still not sure if I'm ever saying correctly, but I've written it correctly in the introduction, which is technomony, I believe. And it is the naming practice where you are named based on your position in a family relationship. So for an example of this, the author of the book is called Syaman Rapongan. Syaman, or Syaman in this case, is, it means father of. And Rapongan is the name of his son. When Syaman Rapongan was a boy, his name was Chekwaga. And then when he had married and had a child, his name changed. And then presumably when his child, should Rapongan go off and have his own children, gives birth to their firstborn, Syaman Rapongan's name will officially change to Syaban, which is the next level up of whatever the child's name is. And so the naming practices are very important, but they're also somewhat confusing if you're not used to it, because there's flashbacks in the story where someone who has one name at one point will then be referred to by a different name because 10 years prior they hadn't had a child yet, and so they are known by something else. And so you have to, it is a book you do have to pay attention to, although it's not too difficult, but you have to read the footnotes.
And the kind of insistence on paying attention, I feel like, is also intentional in a way, because so much of it is about relationality, right? You have to kind of track which part of the generation are we at? Are we at the grandfather? Are we at the son? Are we at the daughter? Are we at the fish? Which generation of fish are we? You know, I think that also speaks to, you know, your point about naming itself reorienting, even our relationship with the characters, or even where we are at in terms of anchoring in the novel itself. And I think this leads me to the next question, which is a translation question.
Yeah.
Is the kind of power of translation. This is the fact that this is now translated for the Anglophone audience to read, right? So this has been available for Sinophone audience for a while, but by translating this, you really open this up to like completely different genealogies of conversation now, right? That it also wrestles it away from kind of being locked into that Sinophone relationship with either Han-Chinese culture or Dao culture now. You also open it up to the Oceanic, right? It then becomes part of the Oceanic conversation. Pele Hiofa, Sea of Islands. I see some of my students here who've read it, yes. And they've written beautiful essays about Hiofa's work. But by translating this into English, then it really opened. I was just so excited when I saw it. I was like, I can teach this next year.
Yeah.
I could teach this with Hiofa, right?
Yeah.
I could teach this with Julian Ogden. I could teach this with these Chamorro writers too, to think about like Guahan and relationship to the Orchid Islands. That doesn't kind of lock it back into the question about Han colonization anymore. It becomes a larger conversation that can tie into conversations about Native Americans here. Also even the oceanic literature that taps into the Caribbean, right? Yeah. So can you say a few words? This is to me one of the most exciting parts, is that I get to teach this in my classrooms now. Yeah. And that for the longest time it's really hard to kind of, I teach the Oceanic all the time, but it's very hard to tie it into the Taiwan context or the Orchid Island context, and this really opens it up.
Yeah. So much to say. Yes. I think I would start by saying the teaching question is also, I think, one of the other motivations for this, is that I want to teach this kind of work, and it doesn't exist in English yet. And so if no one else is going to do it, I will just do it and do it myself. Thank you. So I think I'm very excited that it is teachable and available for classes and has scaffolding for that. To the questions about Oceanic things, I think so in the book, when you open it up, there is the main story, Eyes of the Sky, and before that there is in lieu of a preface, and this is same in the original publication of the text as well. Syaman Rapongan did not write his own preface. He just wrote you another short story that's about 10 pages long that also kind of is a encapsulated Dao worldview and a bit of kind of background about himself. And in this story, the protagonist is him as a young child. And one night he's waiting for his father to come back from fishing at night, and he falls asleep between these canoes while he's waiting. And this kind of big, large fish comes and takes him on an oceanic journey. And when the minute he hops on the back of this fish, he's like, "You can't take me to Taiwan. I can't speak that language. I don't know those people." And the fish says, "Yeah, I know. I'm taking you to the Philippines." Yes. And so we're going south. And I think that's one of the really interesting, speaking of like reorientations in the novel, is that although Taiwan maintains a colonial relationship to Orchid Island, it doesn't really have a historical relationship that is much deeper than that. And so I guess it's maybe worth adding here as some context too, that the indigenous people of Taiwan generally, and especially on Orchid Island, are Austronesian of descent. They are not Han. And so that they are connected, genetically speaking, to a different set of people. They're not oriented towards the continent and China, but towards kind of Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and a completely different world. And the language that they speak, the Dao language, is mutually intelligible with that from the Bataan Islands of the northern Philippines, but not with the other indigenous languages on the island of Taiwan. There are some minor linguistic overlaps, but they're not mutually intelligible completely the way they are going south. And so the author himself actually, and I'm forgetting the year, but you can check his Facebook if you're interested, which is open to the public, and he's very active. But I want to say maybe it was a pre-pandemic trip that he takes, where he hops in one of the canoes that they build, and takes a very long journey kind of through part of Southeast Asia on his boat. And when he went to the Philippines, they asked him to come and help them relearn the art of boat carving because they had lost it. But because their cultures were so closely aligned, he was able to help kind of restore that tradition in somewhere that's not connected to China at all. And then as you continue, he travels all over, and I think it's a multi-month kind of journey that he makes. And it's all about the Pacific. It's all about islands. It's all about these connections between islands and island cultures that have nothing to do with China or Taiwan at all. And I think that's actually, if he had his way, Orchid Island would have nothing to do with Taiwan, with China, Chinese culture. Although to some extent, he does also participate in that literary system, so he's able to voice these things through the colonial system. He occupies a very interesting positionality. But he doesn't really want that connection in the first place. And so he's very aware of that and writes with that in mind. And then I would add one other comment, perhaps.
Yes.
You'd mentioned the Caribbean.
Yes.
And I think that is one of the things that I've seen scholars from Taiwan who write about, literary critics who write about Syaman or Rapongan bring this up. And that is kind of Edouard Glissant and Kamau Brathwaite. And this kind of idea of relationality or living in relation with. It's a word we've been using, but it actually is inspired by Caribbean theory and this idea that the unity is perhaps submarine. And so you may not see it over land, you may not see it in culture, but we're all connected underground by the way the ocean connects everything together. And so if you reorient the way you think about things, it changes how you see the connections between people. And there is so much resonance, I would say, between these kind of anti-colonial theories of the Caribbean and the work of Syaman Rapongan, because he really is writing against a colonial situation. And how he does that is by revealing these connections as a kind of, not even a form of resistance, because he is one of the few people, I think, who has not capitulated and said, okay, I'll play by your rules and speak your language. He's going to speak his own language, and you can come along for the ride if you want. And so in doing so, he really takes a quite influential position that is capable of helping people rethink their relationship to each other, to nation states and identities. And I don't know, it's one of the reasons that I think the book is really valuable.
No, I really love that you brought that up in terms of thinking through the different oceanic spaces that this really opens up, especially when we think through the English translation, that really opens that up, right? Because a lot of work has been done in Caribbean studies, a lot of work has been done in Pacific studies, right? That because of the long history of U.S. occupation of these Pacific islands, Hiofa has been writing in English, right? A lot of folks, American Samoans, are writing in English. Julian Ogden's writing in English. And so it forges very direct conversations across these kind of indigenous tribes and lineages of thought. And just kind of going to exactly your point about when we think about then understanding this piece in relationship to that long and at this point capacious genealogy of oceanic literature now. And I'm thinking about how Hiofa's idea of sea of islands versus island in the sea completely reorients everything, right? That if we understand that places like Orchid Island, right, are not just an island in the sea, but actually part of a long ecosystem of sea of islands, it is the largest ecosystic relational body of power relations there is, right? The Pacific Islands being the largest body itself. And so it really reorients exactly to your point, and not in a way of like direct kind of reactionary resistance, but actually in terms of just completely reorienting everything by just changing worldview. And I think this actually goes into my next question, which is, I'm sorry, it's pretty big. But if we start thinking about this in relationship to the Caribbean, right? Start thinking about this in relationship to the Pacific Islands, then we are able to think through the long history of racial capitalism and the long history of settler colonialism. And how do you see this piece really bringing that to the fore and bringing these kind of longer genealogies of connection? Like that was a really good example of that, right? Like the connection to the Philippines, right? that can unearth these kind of larger and perhaps even deeper connections that have a lot to do with actually a critique of the long history of racial capitalism.
Yeah, very big question.
Sorry.
No, it's a good question. I think in this particular story, there are implicit, or not even implicit, there are critiques of this, but it kind of pops in and pops out of the story as the narrative evolves.
Yeah.
And I think it forms the backdrop to everything.
Right.
Because there is this sense that, for a good example,
Yes.
we have in chapters kind of 2 and 3 of the novel as it's developing, the children of the kind of narrator end up all kind of one by one moving to Taiwan for work. And this has been a long kind of developing problem over the 70s and 80s in Taiwan, where a lot of indigenous communities were not finding employment anywhere, and they ended up leaving their homes to go down to the lowlands, as they call them, because many lived in the mountains on the Taiwanese main island anyway, and they worked in factories. And they hang and swung from scaffoldings, and they did all the dangerous work that was underpaid, or in many cases they would have their ID cards confiscated so they couldn't change their jobs, and they kind of became unofficially trapped by their employers to do unpaid labor or marginally paid labor. And all of that is the context for this story. So the character that dies partway through the novel is actually essentially diagnosed from overwork.
Yes.
She died from exhaustion and taking a bunch of medication to try to manage her exhaustion. And that is because she was trying to pay a mortgage on a house, and she wanted to get the mortgage on the house so that she could give it to her son to bring him from Orchid Island to Taiwan, where he could then go to a Han school. And the point was to try to get him ahead in the education system so that he didn't end up like her or her parents.
Yeah.
And so in terms of kind of what racialized capitalism is doing to all these things, you see it playing out in a very quotidian, like daily life way throughout the novel. On a grander scheme, you see this happening in Syaman Rapongan's writing more broadly, which takes us a little bit away from this particular novel, but I think it's very important that he tries to reorient worldviews the same way he does in this novel and a lot of his other works. And so it's seeing overfishing or overconsumption through the lens of gluttony. Think about it as one of, as a seven deadly sin type of thing. It is this object for critique, and it's because it throws the world out of balance, and this imbalance is caused by the capitalistic desire for profit. You're looking to, there's a passage in this novel in particular where he's describing trawling and the effects of it, and they take all these huge netfuls of fish and drop them into their main ship to go sail home. And I forget the exact wording, but he describes seeing the captain of the ship, looking down with that big grin that says, "I'm going to make a lot of money." And he said, this is the problem with the Han-Taiwanese, is that they're there for the money, not there for the ecology, the environment, the people. And so the critique is pervasive, even if it is not directly said, and I'm critiquing racial capitalism,
Yes.
but the implication is always there.
Yeah, and I think I love the ways he kind of always kind of addresses this really on the side in very kind of generous ways. Like even the postscript of the whole piece, right? He talks a little bit about just the process of closing out writing.
Mm-hmm.
And he closed out and writing this piece, and then he was telling his loved one that, "Hey, I finished the novel." And she's like, "Oh, okay." And then he was like, "Oh, I guess then I should go fishing." And she's like, "Yes, go fishing." And then so he ended the whole postscript with him going fishing and catching, I don't remember, like 70 or 80 flying fish, right? And that to his loved ones in that relationship in the household that has a drying rack for flying fish, right? That meant more than finishing the novel, because that actually provided for the livelihood of one's loved ones and their spirits and the continuity of culture, of relation, and taking care of loved ones. And there's so much of conversation about the fact that he provides for his partner by never letting her buy fish. He always catches fish. It's always directly from the sea. so you don't have to go through the marketized process, right? Kind of going into the kind of the tragedy of the daughter dying over overwork because of the kind of a relationship to land and relationship to home that is privatized, that is built on property relations, right? This is actually something that is relational. He also talks about the ways in which he catches fish is not through motorboats, like what you're saying, right? He like dives by himself. He says he motors by his lungs, right? He doesn't motor by anything else. He motors by his body, and he catches them with his hands, right? You say more.
Yeah, no, I have two comments.
Yes.
First, on just the last part there about all the diving and things. I, as a very proud Kansan, this was a very fun book to translate because I had to learn a lot about the ocean, notoriously landlocked state that I come from. And so when it comes to all of these boats and these fishing techniques, he uses spear guns, he'll go skin diving. He does all of these different things, and it was educational for me also, because you might see these things in a movie and be like, oh, that's interesting. But when you're actually reading about it and have to figure it out, it's quite the process, and building up one's lung capacity and all of the way that you motor yourself is really interesting. And then to the earlier comment about his wife not caring that he finished a novel, I love that. But I think I can add a little context to that too. And so in another piece that he's written elsewhere, there is a whole conversation about how his family has accused him of becoming a Sinicized Dao, so like becoming a Chinese-like Dao person, and that's precisely because he wants to write. So, you know, he has this quote somewhere, you know, like, in our culture, there's no such thing as an intellectual, there's no such thing as a writer. It's like, you go, men fish, women do the fields and the taro, and we have our own kind of balanced ecosystem, and writing is superfluous to it. And so he would, you know, write like a thief at night, he would say, and then go to the seas during the day. But even the act of writing itself is already coded as a Han kind of activity. And so for him to be participating in that at all is already a concession to colonial culture. And then in the postscript too, he makes a somewhat of a confession about this. And he says, you know, I've given you all these footnotes. I do want you to kind of be able to follow the story or have enough. But like, you read, and then he gives you a footnote once, maybe twice if you're lucky. And then as you go on, the footnotes kind of, they stop, or they diminish somewhat. And suddenly you're left to just remember everything. And then you get to the postscript, he's like, actually, this book wasn't for you. He's like, I was talking to my friend down the street, and I wanted to record these stories. And what's important to me is that the story is right. He's like, if you came along for the ride, I'm very happy you came along for the ride. But it's not about you, colonial Han reader, or now Anglophone reader, should you decide to take on the challenge. But it is about being able to tell those stories the way that he wants to tell them. And so I think that is one of the ways that he really carefully tries to thread the needle of participating in colonial culture without being co-opted by it or subsumed by it. And it's getting harder and harder. As a kind of plug for him, he is a multi-decorated, award-winning, you name it kind of writer in Taiwan. But the state continually tries to position him as a particular kind of writer, being indigenous and non-Han specifically, and being connected to these oceanic kind of pathways and not oriented toward the mainland. There's a lot of politicization about this is what makes Taiwan unique or distinct from China. So it gets into the geopolitics of things that he wants nothing to do with. But these awards keep trying to position him as a writer that shows the uniqueness of Taiwan. And so there's also this tension that happens in the background of his writing that he's aware of, but he wants to record his stories and make sure that they survive, and so he writes. And he collects his awards to kind of maintain that, but he takes a lot of that money, reinvests it in the island. He's opened museums on the island. He runs a lot of kind of charities. Should you ever make the trip, there's a beautiful museum to, well, this is taking a minor tangent, to the nuclear reactor. Is that?
Go for it.
Yeah, so once upon a time, the KMT, or the nationalist government in Taiwan, told the people of Dao Island they were going to build a fish canning factory, which turned out to be a nuclear storage waste facility, and you know, not a great look. And one of the things that Syaman Rapongan does with his money is that he funds a museum on the island to the history of this process, supports local art, local activism against it, and he is, the money that he gets out of the colonial machine, as it were, is reinvested into the preservation of indigenous stories and lifeways.
I love that too, and even just with that example of the nuclear waste facility, right, that naturally just joins in coalition with a lot of the anti-nuclear coalitions across the Pacific that has been ongoing for generations at
Yeah.
this point, right? And those are kind of natural pathways that he doesn't even need to kind of emphasize. It's like it's naturally there because of the kind of shared material conditions that are forced for survival.
Yeah.
And I love the point that you also mentioned that so much of the novel, when you do read it, there is so much built-in critique of certain forms of knowledge production, right? That the daughter died because the only reason why she wanted to go to Taiwan was because she was abused as in the school system in Orchid Island, being called that, that she was backward and she was not smart enough, right? Even though she was still top of the class all the time and being told by her Han teacher that she was not worthy of being in the classroom, and that she was telling her parents that all she wants to do is go to Taiwan, get a degree, come back and open and teach the children of the Dao children, their own culture, right, to stand up tall against the Han, right? But then of course she dies of overexhaustion and never gets to make it back.
Yeah.
But then in the postscript, like this is kind of built in as a critique, but in the postscript he even says that like so much of the story is from his mom's imagination,
Yeah.
right? That the storytelling is not something, even though he's using the craft, maybe colonial craft, right? But the seed and the imagination and the vision is intergenerational.
Yeah, I think so in the postscript he talks about how Eyes of the Sky in particular, and if you have the opportunity to ever read anything else of his, this is an image that recurs. And the way that it's described as the eyes of the sky, one are the stars, obviously. I think that's a fairly intuitive kind of reading. But the other part is from the Oceanic world, the kind of flying fish scales that float to the top of the sea as the fish look up. Their eyes in the sky are these kind of fish scales that refract the light. And so you have this multiple levels of eyes of the sky, and it all comes kind of from his mother's storytelling. The other half of that, though, I think, is in the postscript, there's another section where he talks about another friend who lives down the street, whose son had suffered the same fate as the daughter who dies in the story. And so it is an incorporation of kind of imagination with reality, or maybe it is a kind of a permutation of the two, because I think the other thing that's really interesting about his writing is he'll call this a novel, and if you pick it up, it's a novel. However, critics in Taiwan regularly tell him this is not the structure of a novel. This can't be a novel, because it doesn't work the same way that you expect when you pick up a novel in the West, let's say. The structure is different, and part of that is because although it has chapters and it has syntax that you're probably familiar with, it is reframed in such a way that it's going to feel somewhat foreign, no matter what you do to it as a translator. And I wouldn't want to get rid of that either.
Yeah.
And so part of the opening of the story by telling you from the perspective of a fish is actually the incorporation of a kind of Dao oral storytelling tradition. It is often that when you pass down knowledge, you gather people around you and you say, I have heard. And this is how the novel opens. It tells you, I have heard, and you begin telling a story. But in this case, stories are knowledge, stories are wisdom, and so the story is a vehicle of passing down tradition. And so although it is a colonial framework in the form of a novel, he has broken it apart as best he can and rebuilt it around indigenous storytelling structures in a way that makes it, it challenges you to be like, oh, that's different, or that's new, I wonder why that is.
Right.
And you discover new things, hopefully, about your own worldview in the process.
Yeah, and even within the kind of structure itself, like there's a refusal even to line break between chapters, that the chapters really just kind of bleed into each other, right? There's no like a page and then you have a new chapter. So very kind of that oceanic relational kind of format itself. So this leads me to my last question, and we'll open it up to the conversation here. If there's one thing you would want the audience here or the readers to take away, what would that be?
Oh.
Hard one.
It is, yeah. So that's an excellent. There's so many things.
Yes.
I guess it would be that there are more ways to look at the world than the one that you've approached the book with, and that I hope that through reading the book, you're able to reimagine your own life and your own relationships in a way that whether or not I don't expect you to read the novel and go change your whole life, but I mean, if you do, good for you, and I encourage this. But it's a way to kind of reflect on your own practices and the way that you live your own lives, such that if it is overconsumption, or you haven't thought about balance in your life, or you haven't thought about your relationship to non-human animals, whether this is fish or nature or whatever, hopefully the novel doesn't just ask you to do it, but gives you a framework, or gives you the opportunity to practice doing it through the reading. And I hope that's maybe the thing that you can take away from this, is a kind of different viewpoint on the world.
I love that, and I think that is a great way to end our conversation part of this. I think we're just gonna open it up for Q&A.
So I'm just wondering, like, at least like now, 2026, like, how does this new island has like different, and how does the local people see this new change?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and a great observation to make over that kind of 10-year period, because the thing I think that has made the hugest difference in that regard is COVID-19 and the pandemic. So during the lockdown, people generally not able to travel abroad, and so for people in Taiwan, the only place you can go on vacation, as it were, is Orchid Island. And during the pandemic, they saw a boom in tourism from the Taiwanese mainland to Orchid Island, and it meant that it reoriented the economy. People went, it regularized the going of it, so it kind of built into this, it got built into people's travel itineraries as a place you want to go to, and it's led to a buildup of kind of infrastructure for tourism. The roads have improved. There's a 7-Eleven now on the... The 7-Eleven on the island, which didn't ever used to be there, and is when you're looking for something that's not a fish, as the vegetarian that I am, it's a really life-saving place to go on occasion. And so that's the upshot of this. The downside, however, is the environmental destruction that having that kind of a massive influx of tourism has brought. And so there's a huge amount of waste on the island that they don't know what to do with or how to get rid of. And there are other kind of, just having that much traffic on the island is changing the way that people go about their daily lives. So, and people are coming back, and they can have jobs in tourism, but it is creating the cycle of kind of unsustainable lifestyle. So it is kind of becoming subject to these kind of capitalistic impulses of tourism, consumption, and there is a growing tension, or it depends who you talk to, but there's definitely an intergenerational tension that is worth describing there, because for older generations in particular, the carving of boats and the kind of going to the fields and planting taro and maintaining those lifeways are very, very important. And for the younger generation, I think this also is either in the postscript to the novel or the preface, and one of the two. But there's this moment where Syaman or Rapongan's nephew comes along. He says, "Come take a ride in my motorboat." And he's like, "Nah, I'm good." But it means that the younger generations are starting to get on motorboats. They don't necessarily have to go and craft their own tatala, which is the name of the boat or the canoe that they carve, and take it out. And so there is a shift towards more technology, towards more consumption. But whether or not that is a direct trade-off with Dao tradition is what remains to be seen. And I think the novel suggests that there's room for both, that one can have a modern motorboat and also maintain tradition, but how much of that is kind of speculative and hopeful versus empirical is something we're going to find out in the next 10, 20 years as things continue to develop.
What were some of the challenges, perhaps some fun moments that you had in tackling specific slang author used?
Yeah, the translation was both a joy and a nightmare at the same time, because you read it and you intuitively know what you want it to say, but then putting it into English is actually quite difficult. And I think the things that were actually the hardest for me were getting the balance of kind of indigenous language to English correct. And in some cases, in the original novel, he will use the word pindanchuan or pindanzhou for the tatala, which is the ship that is pieced together from planks of wood. And I have made the choice in the novel to use tatala as a standard for it throughout. I introduce it once, there's the footnote given telling you kind of what it is, and then it just reappears. And in the original Chinese text, that is not a choice the author makes. He does other things, or he'll use other words, or he'll use Mandarin transliterations of indigenous words that you then have to kind of reverse engineer to figure out what they are. And I was actually just telling Lily upstairs that in my office at Georgetown, I have these variety of dictionaries, and one of them is a dictionary of fish. And it's a color picture of a fish that has the indigenous language, the Chinese, many names of Chinese, the possible English common names, the Latin name, and it gives you like the kind of lore or the history behind the fish. And I have one of those for fish, I have one for birds, I have one for plants, and I would sit and just go through these dictionaries on end to try and make sure that it's as accurate as it can be while maintaining readability. Sometimes there are plants in particular that we just don't have common names for in English because they don't exist in either, the Anglophone world. And so I've adopted a kind of slightly modified version that reads a bit nicer. And, that's on me as translator that I said, we're not going to get that specific Latin name into this because that's not how someone talks. And a lot of the tone of the novel, because the opening chapter is this kind of storyteller persona, is very casual for most of it. And so I've tried to maintain that as we go along as well.
I'm kind of like stuck with a story about that girl who had to left the island to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is her story being to show that how education system actually shape people's sense of self-worth? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So she is I don't want to call her a minor character, but she's never the protagonist of the novel, as it were, but she appears primarily through diary entries that get left behind. So her introduction mostly comes after she has passed away. And when the family goes to collect the remains, they go to her house and they find this diary. Whether or not they should have read it, different question, but they start going through her diary and we get to know the daughter through her diary entries. And as Lily had mentioned earlier, her motivation for pursuing education was when she was in Orchid Island, she had these Han teachers that would just call all these students idiots and stupid and they weren't supposed to be there. And she said, I want to go become a teacher so that I can teach my own people and, and lift them up. And in that sense, I think her role is somewhat a critique of the education system and how it has failed the Dao people. And then it develops into this other process where to get the credential for becoming a teacher is also almost an insurmountable challenge for someone of indigenous heritage, at least at that time, because although she says in one of the diaries, she was top of her class, she won all these awards on Orchid Island, when she got to the Taiwanese mainland, she found she couldn't compete with her peers. And whether that's because they were educated in their first language, she had to learn Mandarin Chinese first and then pursue an education in the Han system. There are these kind of structural issues that are revealed to have been holding her back all the time. She's also sponsored to go through school by a foreign couple. And you also have kind of this, it's a Catholic or Christian for sure, I think it was Catholic, I would need to double check, kind of fund and school that she goes to. And so she's sponsored by a foreign family. And so the cost of even obtaining an education is also something that is gifted to her from outside because her family can't afford it. And she said, my dad's money was fish, my mom was taro. What need do we have for money on an island whose economy doesn't function like a capitalist economy? And so her role kind of casts into high relief all of these contrasting world systems. So not just education, but her role and her death in the novel really serve to highlight the gap between Han-Taiwanese culture and Dao culture, especially across intergenerational boundaries. Or at least that's kind of my view of her.
Do you have any direct interaction with the author?
Yes, I did. I'm gonna have to stop saying 10 years. I'm gonna get really old really fast. But no, I met with Syaman Rapongan many times. It's in the introduction. I went back and checked all of my receipts for this. I think 2016 was the first time that I met him. I was at a conference in Taiwan where, I know you were there. I don't know, we didn't meet there. We met in Boston.
Yes.
But I met him and was instantly drank under the table because he has a good constitution. And that was kind of where we had a conversation about would he allow me to translate his work. So I was grilled somewhat on, what I knew and how I wanted to approach the work, why I wanted to translate it in the first place. And he said, yeah, sure, go ahead. And then down the line, we've met in Taipei before. I visited at his home in Orchid Island before. And he's been very patient because it has taken so long. But he's also very familiar with the academic world At the time that I met him, I was finishing my PhD work and then was trying to find a job. And so the fact that it took that long, I'm sure he would have preferred it happened sooner, but he was very generous with that. And then, yeah, when I visited in Orchid Island, I had just questions about the novel itself. You know, I translated a bulk of it by then, and I said, what do you mean by this? How do I translate this? Do you have a preference for me including the indigenous language this way or not at all? And he kind of talked me through what he wanted to see in the final product of the novel. And you'll notice too, when you page through it even, that some of the dialogue is done in parallel prose. And this is the same way it was printed in the original publication, where you'll have a line in the Dao language, and then kind of in brackets, it's either the Han-Chinese translation or the Mandarin or the English translation. But it's important to kind of retain those things. And so we've tried to leave the footprint of Dao culture, Dao language, wherever we can. And I think the balance is meant to be readability. So someone is going to pick it up, someone is going to buy it, someone is going to learn about Dao culture. But when they pick up the book, they're going to have to do the work to learn about Dao culture. And so there's a balance that is hopefully struck when you pick it up, that you see the culture in the novel, and in all of his works really, but in this translation as well. And that was a really big part of our conversations together.
I'm interested in the motivation. So you were familiar with the work. Did you just love it in sort of a literary manner? Or did you feel like the content was really relevant to your sort of academic interests or your career? Or was there something else about it that gave you this huge motivation that allows you to finish a project like this?
A bit of column A, a bit of column B. So on the one hand, it really struck me as something that needed to be made available to teach in classrooms. If we're going to teach about China or Chinese culture, Taiwanese culture in America, it is a voice that needs to be present. And the reason I say this is because I did encounter this novel first in my coursework of my PhD, and when you're doing a course on modern Chinese literature or even Sinophone literature, which is maybe a broader look, so not just PRC, but kind of Chinese language literature across the world, this is not a voice you see a lot. You don't see Austronesian culture reflected in Chinese literature on a regular basis. When you take a course, generally you look at the canon and it's largely works that have come out of China, like the PRC China. And then if you want to teach about Taiwan, often Taiwan gets relegated to, it's either a week or two in a course about Chinese literature more broadly, or it's its own course that gets separated out because it's of such a complex topic that to do it justice, the Taiwan question gets moved to its own class. And within Taiwan, even this is still a marginal text. It's kind of the margins of the margins, and that is, and another colleague of ours has written about indigenous literature in this way. And so that was part of the motivation, was that I was interested because it was different, and I wanted to see that reflected in my teaching and in my research. And then that gets to the other half of this. It is aligns with my interest research more broadly, whether it is writing about indigeneity, queerness, language, globally, these kind of minoritized positions are things that are interesting to me because I am curious about how those who maybe are either denied the access or the ability to speak for themselves or access to power, how they creatively find ways to build their identities, express themselves, or kind of maintain a distinct culture within these kind of broader hegemonic systems. And so it triggered my research interests for sure. And if I ever finish the monograph, the research monograph I'm writing, this novel appears in it with some of the rest of Syaman Rapongan's works. But from a teaching pedagogical perspective, it just needed to be there. I wanted to teach a class that was Chinese literature that's not the canon, and especially back in the early 2010s, filling that syllabus up for 16 weeks or 15 weeks was almost impossible with any amount of diversity. And so that was kind of one of the other reasons that I decided to undertake the project. Thank you, everybody.